And that goes all across the board, even in BioWare, which again, I will always say give them credit where it's due, but you just see instances like we were talking about earlier, Sky and Silk Fox from Jade Empire. It's all just a matter of trying to make sure that no one's going to see the content if they absolutely do not want to, going way out of their way to just prevent someone from seeing it and having their morality hurt or something like that.
That's why I sneak like male kissing scenes in like the middle of my videos, just so that like if you have a problem with it, you're gonna see it. Like I'm not gonna warn you. I'm just gonna put that right in the middle.
Oh, fair enough, actually.
Men kissing each other.
I would love that personally.
Have you noticed that? Like in my gay video, I just like put it randomly in the middle. Just like, yeah. I think that's one thing, like, I don't know. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, I think that's one thing that I want to, I think there's men sometimes that will subscribe to my channel and have no problem with the idea of me talking about lesbian romances or showing lesbian romance scenes, but then like I've gotten these messages and emails from guys saying like, I first just subscribed to your channel because I was like, sweet lesbian, YouTuber, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And then they were like, the more I watched your videos, the more that I became less of a homophobe, and now I'm supportive of gay men as well. And I'm like, well, if I'm gonna hook you in, I might as well, like steer you towards accepting the gay men as well. But I think that, it's a horrible like double standard. Like that it's okay for two women to make out, but two men.
Yeah.
I think that's something that like my gay male friends have pointed out to me. They're like, you can make out with a girl in a public place, and no one has a problem with it.
Yeah.
Especially if it's in a bar, because people just think you're really drunk if you do that in a bar. But like, if two guys make out in a bar, in a straight bar, it's like, everyone's looking at you.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not only that. I mean, I've had to watch straight people, be physical with each other all the time. And
most people will agree that no one should do that in public for the most part.
I agree. Yes, I agree that people can make the argument, oh, well, it doesn't matter if you're gay or straight. I don't want to see that. I don't want to see any of that in public, which,
But you'll still see a lot more people disapproving.
Yeah, it's legitimate, but I mean, I just have an issue when people say I don't want to see certain things because I don't believe in it or I don't disagree with it, because, I don't agree with smoking, but I watch people smoke on TV or on movies. I'm not a big fan of murder. And yet, the same people who don't like to watch two men kissing have no issues watching people butchering. Yeah, but
more offended by gay men kissing.
More offended by gay men kissing than like violence in shows and things like that. I mean, in general, I mean, we're going a little bit off topic, but the parents who don't want their kids watching, the parents who don't want to have their kids watch two men, kissing, and not like making out, just like a kiss goodbye, but they're perfectly fine with having them watch like some really violent, movie or what have you, and that bothers me.
And what's especially ridiculous is that especially BioWare games. I mean, I'm pretty sure they're almost all rated mature. I mean, 17 right there on the box and whatnot.
Yeah, first-person shooters. It's okay for my kid to watch first-person shooters, but God forbid you have a romance scene.
And I mean, the truth is, realistically speaking, yes, there are minors who are very much not 17 who are going to get their hands on all of those games if their parents let them or if they have the means and whatnot. And yet people make so big of a deal of, oh, what if a child sees this or whatnot, when technically they're still not supposed to. I mean, it just kind of shows, well, it kind of puts obviously the rating system into question if that's the case. But, the point is that, okay, not even getting into why it may not be appropriate for children or whatnot, that's a whole other thing. But
most children have probably already seen porn at this point. you know?
I mean, even if you do buy that maybe it's not for children, it's explicitly supposed to be for mature people anyway.
Yeah.
And so really children shouldn't come into the equation at all. But of course people
Yeah.
love to come into the equation when it comes to something like this because, well, they make for good bargaining chips in this case. In a sense.
Yeah, I like that you guys seem to have like a more like chill attitude. I think I'm kind of like aggressive when it comes to those things. Like I'm kind of like, you're gonna be cool with this. You're gonna like see these people make out, and if you don't, you walk away. Like I'm not walking away. I think that's like,
fair enough, I guess.
I don't know. Maybe I'm just being a dyke, but
No,
I think like
or maybe it's
like I'm like pretty aggressive when it comes to like if I'm gonna make out with the girl in public, you all can just walk away if you don't like it, you know. And I just think
Sometimes that's kind of how you have to be.
yeah, like I don't know.
I think it's a little bit of a parallel to what you were saying earlier, Kathleen, about things that women have to deal with in terms of like about sexual harassment and things like that. Like there comes a point where you just kind of get used to it, and right now that's just how the world works. And it's kind of the same thing for us. I mean, I know that there's at the moment the world has a specific stigma, and I can't get away with doing certain things with my boyfriend that's normally fairly widely accepted if a male and a female or two females are doing in public. And it's just one of those things that I've just gotten used to, and I just kind of accept right now that that's just the way the world works right now. So.
Makes me mad. Yeah, I mean, I realize like when my gay guy friends tell other guys like in public that they're gay, I realize like I have this instant fear that they're gonna get beaten up. Like, and I don't feel that fear for myself, but like yeah, there's that fear of like that you guys have to face of like physical violence that I don't have as much of a fear of. You know.
Yeah, that's another reason why it also bothers me when, and I hate going back to this topic all the time, but when people are against more LGBT options for romances in video games, is because, I have to deal with, in real life, gay men and gay lesbian women have to deal with the fact that only 10% of anyone that I end up being interested in romantically is actually going to swing in my direction. And not only do I have to like guess whether or not someone is gay or not if I walk into a room of complete strangers and somebody there catches an eye, because there's that stigma. It's not like I can go up to someone, because if I make a mistake, there's always that fear that there's going to be some sort of repercussion. At best, maybe there'll be some awkwardness. Like maybe the guy will be okay with it, or maybe there'll be some awkwardness. But at worst, there can be some really rough consequences depending on who the person is. And that's just, I deal with that on a day-to-day basis. And it's something that I think a lot of straight people never understand or kind of take for granted. So that when you come to a medium like a video game where, yes, it might be a little bit more unrealistic to have a few more gay options. When you're talking about a game like Mass Effect where you've got aliens and you've got like, or Dragon Age when you've got like magic and somebody's like blowing things up with fire with their hands. I mean, that's not really realistic either.
I mean,
it's
sometimes explosions happen.
Let's put it that way.
So what did you say? I'm sorry.
Nothing.
I
said sometimes explosions happen.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. We went there, ladies and gentlemen. But yeah, so I mean, why do they allow for certain unrealistic things to happen in games? It's because it's fun, and it's because it helps somebody really become engaged and really enjoy a game. So, I mean, it would be nice for someone like me to have a little bit more fun because I actually have more options. I don't have to just stick with Zevron if I really wanted another option and not just Zevron. Because in a video game, you can do that. In a video game, you don't have to play by the rules that the real world plays, because it might be more enjoyable if you break the rules a little bit in realism for the sake of more fun for more people.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's been censorship of, just homosexuality in general all across gaming. We already mentioned the Sky and Soapbox from Jedi Empire, but I mean, even to a certain degree in Mass Effect, actually. I mean, if you kind of pay attention and you start to see differences between homosexual romance scenes and their straight counterparts, you do start to see that maybe it's not even all the way out with, surprisingly, Mass Effect 3, which, is otherwise supposed to be pretty progressive. I mean, you still, unfortunately, had people who were so indignant that gay options were allowed into the game that they completely tanked the scores on, like, Metacritic or something just because of that. I mean, not even really caring about any other aspect of the game. But that gay people, they absolutely hated it. But, I mean, one thing I've noticed, and actually I think a good way of summing this up is what you see when you look at Samantha Trainor's romance, and again, this is going somewhat back to the male gaze and what it's being portrayed for, and what you see when you look at the homosexual male romance.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because, as Kathleen said in one of her videos, you've got Samantha Trainor who, spoiler alert, ends up in the shower and, you just kind of go in there and that's part of the romance because.
It's really that easy.
Yeah, it's really that easy. I mean, there's not there's some build-up.
There's the hot tub, too. Samantha likes getting wet. She loves getting wet. That girl loves getting wet.
I usually buy a girl flowers before I jump in her shower, but, whatever.
Mm.
But, that's obviously very sexual. I mean, needless to say, they still didn't get, but it's supposed to be very sexual and whatnot. Whereas, honestly, if you look at Steve Cortez, yes, his romance still has, tinges of sexuality in what he says to you, the banter back and forth. But, I mean, you really don't get any signs of the real physical intimacy for the most part if you go all the way with Steve Cortez. And, yeah, I mean, there's basically not a love scene for them for the most part. I mean, you get to see them embrace and stuff, and that's all well and good. I mean, goodness knows back in the day, even that wasn't allowed. But compared to Trainor, I mean, and even Trainor doesn't get a scene right before the end of the game, but she gets the whole shower scene dedicated specifically to her, whereas Steve...
while wearing clothing.
Yeah,
while wearing clothing.
Because that's how it works. But whereas Steve really...
kids. That's how it works.
Where Steve really doesn't get much. And, this is one of the things, again, that the Citadel DLC amended some. And overall, it still ends up being, a pretty satisfying romance. I mean, obviously, it's one of the best male-male romances I think that's out there, even if it's only for the sense that there really weren't that many to begin with. But you really, and the other thing is Caden, unfortunately. And, this is, a little bit more complicated of a situation because, Caden was meant to be bisexual from the very beginning, but no, they didn't go with that for one reason or another. But then he became bisexual in the third game, and, there's all that controversy in and of itself. But what I actually noticed is that if you romance Caden, spoiler, as a female shepherd, you actually get more to the scene before the love scene. For whatever reason, there's this whole thing where female shepherd gets on top of Caden, like, and is basically sitting on his lap. And there's an option to actually turn him down at that point. Whereas, surprisingly enough, in the same scene with male shepherd, it cuts out before you're actually even allowed to say, you know what, let's not do this. You actually cannot prevent male shepherd, ironically enough, from being with Caden that last night, where you can do that with almost every other love interest. But I guess because for some reason they decided to censor the latter part of that scene, it actually took out an option to not do it, ironically enough.
That's sad, because you get the option to, I mean, it's not even a rejection. Like, you get the option to just cuddle with him.
Yeah, and I mean, that's basically what it is cuddling. I think they still, for some reason, end up in their underwear. I'm not really sure what the point of that was. I don't know. But, I mean, it's still, you're still able to get that option to at least believe nothing happened. I mean, okay, it was just weird. But, I mean, you actually cannot do that with a male shepherd, which almost seems counterintuitive, because it's like they decided to censor it while also taking out the option to not do it.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, and I was really surprised to find that out. And, And so even though for the most part they're pretty similar, even the male and female versions of the Kaden romance have pretty striking differences.
Mm.
Some of them just kind of make you think, well, okay, they kind of went back on it a little bit. So even Mass Effect 3, unfortunately, is far from perfect when it comes to this. I think they still had to count their chickens a little bit, maybe, and not without, again, with considering the reaction, not without reason. But, and other than that, I also have put down that actually, surprisingly enough, as early as Neverwinter Nights 2, apparently, I think it's the Mask of the Betrayer expansion.
Yes, I think it was. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that I believe the male love, spoiler alert, was supposed to be at least bisexual, but that Wizards of the Coast, the company that I guess is involved with Dungeons and Dragons and all that, they absolutely vetoed it. In that case, there was actually complete political pressure to not include it, and you see that all across the board too.
Yeah, Axton from Borderlands 2, the commando, was supposed to be bisexual, and they totally took that part out of his script as well.
Quite a few, and we already talked about Kaden earlier, but there were quite a few other characters that were apparently supposed to be bisexual, and then it was just not realized. I mean, apparently Miranda, of all people, spoiler alert, was supposed to be bisexual.
I can see that. Mm-hmm.
And I think, rumor has it that Tali maybe was going to be too, and I think you can kind of assume
she flirts hardcore with FemShep.
And what's really funny about this,
I was really disappointed that wasn't because there are some serious signs that she has feelings for you, even if you play as female shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
But they never really went with that, even though there was a serious sign.
Rumor has it, and this may not be true. This may just be one of those stories that evolved over time. But rumor has it that they were going to make Tali bisexual, but apparently the voice actress might not have been comfortable with it. But then you got the third game where that same voice actress ends up saying a whole thing about, spoiler alert, how Tali would like to have a threesome with Garrus and female shepherd, and you're like, huh, okay. So yeah, I mean, and apparently even, spoiler alert, Ashley was supposed to be bisexual in the first Mass Effect, which, you can sit there and argue about whether or not that would have been a good idea.
And Ashley was another religious character.
Yep.
Yeah, there you go. And that's true too. I mean, I can sort of, there's certain aspects where I can maybe understand why they didn't go with her maybe in particular. I mean, actually, I think maybe going back to the gender thing, I think one of the coolest things about Mass Effect is that Ashley and Kaden's combat roles were switched to how you would expect them to be. I mean, Ashley was the hardcore soldier, more or less, whereas Kaden had a lot more of what you would maybe
supporting
back in the day, a supporting role. He was sort of a maybe what fantasy people would consider like a mage rogue hybrid, which are considered somewhat more feminine on the hierarchy of classes.
I did like that.
That's one of the things I think is kind of cool, and I think that in that sense, it's kind of cool that Ashley did end up being only her male shepherd, was because you could have just as easily sat there and said, "Oh, she's a real big masculine butch lesbian" or something like that.
True.
And, yeah, and the same would have probably been for Jack. I mean, maybe in some cases it was more refreshing not to go that direction, but it's still a shame that they just went back on so much. I mean, I think even supposedly Thane might have potentially been.
I heard that too.
To be the first bisexual male character, and sure enough, they just.
I would have romanced Thane.
Oh
had
yeah,
he been bisexual for Greg.
Cool.
Even knowing what would happen to him, I would have.
Yeah, I think that would have been really cool. Just this, they just went back on it so many times. Not that I blame them completely, but it's so clear how the series evolved, even if in some ways it really took some coding to get there. Society's going to march on, and certainly we're going to see what the next offerings are going to offer up for Mass Effect in particular. But it's just kind of crazy how much censorship there is of it, even to a certain degree recently.
Yeah. I think you started to talk about this a little bit, but we haven't really fully gone into this. there aren't many gender-bending, genderqueer, or transgender characters in games.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
You
for the
know,
next
I would love to see a gay, like, butchy character, you know, like, because that is a part of the community, and being able to, like, represent that without everyone throwing up their arms and getting, like, upset about it would be great, because I think there's this, like, push to be like, oh yeah, like, you know, lesbian characters, we don't want to go towards the butch stereotype, but, like, there
Yeah.
are butch lesbians, and, you know, you could have a butch lesbian character and not represent her in a stereotypical way. Like, she could still have tender aspects of her character. And I don't know, what do you guys think about that in terms of gay men? Like,
I
you
mean,
know,
this tends to go a lot. You tend to see a lot of, I guess you could say, inclination towards gender roles in the classes that characters are able to be and what their abilities are. I mean, you see this all across the board in Dragon Age. I mean, one of the things about Dragon Age Origins that was really apparent is how, for one reason or another, the gender roles played really heavily. Like traditional, like, you know, you have women mages and maybe a rogue, and you've got the male warriors and maybe one
Mm-hmm.
rogue. I mean, you know, very traditional kind of gender roles for combat and whatnot. And that was one of the things that was interesting. Of course, you could absolutely make your main character completely defy the gender stereotype and whatnot. Because, I mean, really, there were 10 companions, I think, in Dragon Age Origins. A lot, and most of them were men, and most of those men were warriors. There was one male rogue, and then the two mages were women, and a rogue was a woman. So you really didn't, for the most part, see a lot of play with that. Which, thankfully, sorry?
And Shale's character was meant to be a surprise when you found out
Yeah.
Shale's gender.
Yeah, so that
Purposely
was,
a surprise. Mm-hmm.
yeah, so that was cool. And, you know, probably provided a little more variety than otherwise. But it kind of hits you at a certain point. Wow, these are very gender role specific characters, not in personality so much, just as their combat role. And you see this a lot in fantasy, just in general. You know, you tend to have the healers be female more often than not, and whatnot. You tend to have, and you know, this goes into sexuality too, obviously, as we sort of addressed before. And thankfully, they did sort of start to wise up to this by the time of Dragon Age 2. I mean, and even with the DLC for Dragon Age Origins, you had a female warrior in Ariane, and technically in the base game, I think Karina Kuzlin was a warrior. Technically, she was a ranged warrior, but
Mm-hmm.
give credit where it's due. And you didn't have a male mage until Awakening, and then every DLC after that pretty much had a male mage. So they wised up and made it a lot more interesting because, frankly, just having the same gender roles and combat roles for every time, every game is just kind of boring for the most part. I mean, even not considering representation. I think it's really cool that they mix it up more in Dragon Age 2, where you had an elf who was a warrior, you had a woman who was a warrior, and so on and so forth. It's really cool.
Kathleen, what I was gonna say is I definitely am all for having more of the underrepresented members of the LGBTQ community to appear in more video games. Mostly because even as a gay male myself, I would like to get more exposure towards people like transgendered characters because I just feel like I'm still naive and I don't know enough about them. So it'd be great to be able to get to know them through a video game. And even with Bioware games like in Dragon Age, the Dragon Age series, characters that I think are meant to be portrayed as transgender are still very sexualized because there are, if you go to, for example, the Blooming Rose or even I think the Pearl in Dragon Age Origins, they are the courtesans. There's transgendered characters, or at least characters who look female, but when they speak, they have a clearly male voice.
But they're basically
treated. Yeah, and then I think another one appears in the Dragon Age 2 DLC, Mark of the Assassin, when you're talking with...
It's the exact same character.
Yeah, when you're talking with not Tegan, you're talking with Seneschal Bran, or how I refer to him as Sexy Shal Bran.
Yes.
And but it's meant to be more of a joke. Like they're meant to be a punchline, or it's meant to, their characters are more of a humor kind of character, which I think is really disappointing that right now the people who are transgendered tend to be placed in, that's pretty much their purpose in the video game, is to be the butt end of a joke.
Yeah.
So
yeah, they don't really know what to do with those characters yet. And,
yeah,
hopefully that'll be the next batch, I suppose.
exactly.
Yeah,
it's,
and that's society too. I mean, frankly, they still have it a lot worse than we do in some respects. I mean, so all across society, that's gonna have to change at some point, I hope.
Yeah, we still have a long way to go, and I think that's what we keep saying all the time. And credit where credit is due. BioWare still has a ways to go as well to represent, I think, these characters properly.
Yeah, and on that topic, actually, I believe, spoiler alert, in one of the books, there is supposedly a pretty positively represented transgender character. I believe that's the case. Yeah, I believe so. If I've got my information right, I believe there is one character that's supposed to be pretty prominent and transgender, supposed to be, at the very least.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's been confirmed per se, but I think that's the
Yeah, I know. In media in general, usually this is something I'm really passionate about, and something I really should talk about more on my channel is just trans rights. I love trans people. All the trans people I've met in my life have just been amazing, because like the amount of persecution you go through as a gay person is hard, but the amount of persecution you go through as a trans person is
harder.
Like 50 million times worse. And plus, you have to, as a trans person, battle body dysphoria on a regular basis, which is like this feeling of of looking at your body and not feeling like it's the body you're meant to be in, which is a really just hard thing to go through.
Yeah.
And like usually characters in media trans characters in media are depicted as tragic characters. And you see a lot of these documentaries and films about trans people that have been, beaten to death, and that's something that people need to learn about. But also, like, there are few trans people, successful trans characters, and that's why I, really look up to Laverne Cox. She's Laverne Cox is she's a trans woman, and she's a really powerful voice for the trans community. And she plays a trans character in Orange is the New Black. And what I love about her character in that is that she actually has a voice in that, and she's not just like this tragic character in that show.
Awesome.
And I think that, writers and developers need to follow that lead of having a trans character. I love what Laverne Cox said. She said something while she was giving this speech, and she said, "Don't let the T part of the LGBT community is not silent. The T is not silent." And I think that is a great saying. And I think that's something that every LGBT person and ally should remember, So yeah, there, I have my little spiel there.
No problem. Okay. I think we have already touched on racial and ethnic romantic diversity already. So I think we can move on to the next item on the list, which is types of romances.
Yeah, that's where it starts kind of fun.
Obviously, there's the traditional exclusive relationships, but then we get into other things like casual flings and moresomes and things of that nature. So, Jonathan, what do you want to?
We brought up earlier. I mean, that's one thing, like I said earlier, that people are starting to desire more and more as romances, ironically enough, I guess you could say, become more accepted and commonplace. People maybe are starting to get a little bored with the typical romance progression, and they want something that's a little, they want some variety in how the relationship plays out. And there are a number of ways, as in real life, that it can. One of which, and that BioWare, it looks like, is particularly fond of is either to have a casual fling. I mean, I think, and there's a lot of optional sexual encounters in games in general that really don't add much to the narrative, period. But what BioWare likes to do with some of their romances is to have it start out as seeming like a more casual fling, and then be given the option, well, A, to either just leave it there and just have it be absolutely a fling and that there's nothing more to it, or to have it develop more into an actual relationship.
Right.
Which usually requires quite a bit of effort with the character involved, depending, but is actually ends up being very rewarding in that regard. I mean, you've got Zebran and Morrigan from Dragon Age Origins, who both start out basically just wanting to have sex with you, and then over time can start to develop feelings if you push hard enough. Ironically enough, it's actually lesbian females who are not given a romance with the option to do that, surprisingly. And of course, in Dragon Age, you have Isabella, who I think is probably the only character who will allow for that exactly. Other than also in the Mark of the Assassin DLC, you also have Talus, who is more of a fling, but maybe could be considered along the lines of a relationship with. And surprisingly, actually, Angel Arts, I don't know if you knew this about the Sir Gilmore mod, but you are actually able to be friends with benefits with Sir Gilmore and not have relationships. Yeah,
I did know that. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, you see that kind of thing all across Dragon Age, which gives a little variety. It makes relationships a little more interesting, I suppose, whenever they're not. Love may not be the ultimate goal always, and so you work up to it a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And in Mass Effect, you have some really interesting examples of this in Mass Effect. One of the biggest reasons for it being that a lot of the more fling kind of relationships can actually be detrimental and can actually lead to more negative consequences than positive ones.
You're talking about Morin.
Yes, Morin, for instance, is just a bad idea all across the board. In general, just don't with Morin if you're. In
general, yes.
Character is sane.
Unless you want a really funny scene,
I mean, yes, it's humorous in a way, I guess, that you, especially if you see it coming, I suppose. Mm-hmm. But then, also surprisingly,
it was worth it.
Maybe it is. Who knows? But then also, surprisingly, in Mass Effect 2, what some people may not necessarily know is that Jack technically can start out, in keyword being can, start out as a casual fling, but one that goes pretty wrong, actually. This is one of the few cases I've seen in a game where just having a fling with someone completely, makes them hate you. For the most part, Jack will not talk to you, for the most part, again, if you just decide to want her body. And I mean, it makes perfect sense for a character, actually. It's a really cool aversion to what you might expect. And then other than that, you've got the characters who more or less just stay as flings, for better or worse, like Diana Allers and Kelly Chambers, who we've already mentioned. But those tend to be kind of interesting and a way of mixing things up a little bit because, if you can make romance out of a friends with benefits situation, it just tends to have a different progression. Mm-hmm. And then on the complete opposite side of that, you also have a surprising number of celibate or relationships that approach celibacy, where it's either part of the romance in general for you not actually have any real physical contact with that character, or it's possible through careful means and whatnot. It can depend, but the two biggest examples from BioWare, and who people are actually, for games that are sometimes criticized for being very sexual, are surprised to have options like this. As we may have mentioned earlier, Sebastian from Dragon Age 2 is completely celibate, as well as hetero-romantic. Mm-hmm. And you also have probably the more interesting option in Samara in Mass Effect 2. Mm-hmm. And both of these characters are cool because they give an option for potentially a main character who's more or less asexual or just doesn't tend to lean towards physical intimacy as a form of as an end goal of a relationship and whatnot. So it actually is good for diversity reasons that they include those kinds of characters as well. And in Samara's case, she's biromantic too, so it allows for even more variation. And then what actually I found really interesting, and this took quite a bit of research to really determine some of this, and some of it still may not be correct, but in Mass Effect, again, despite the fact that Mass Effect kind of has a reputation for having the end goal be sex, it seems like there's a surprising number of ways that you can maybe, other than not having a romance, obviously, there's a surprising number of ways it seems like that you can just basically not have sex with the person you're romancing and still romance them. Now, obviously, there's still banter involved that can be useful. I mean, so that might make it hard for, say, an asexual shepherd to really feel realistic and whatnot. But I know that in Mass Effect 1, and I think at least in certain romances in Mass Effect 2 perhaps, and in Mass Effect 3, they sort of vary as to whether or not you may be able to do this, I think. As I mentioned earlier, Kaiden's romance with a male shepherd, surprisingly enough, cannot have the sex scene be skipped. For whatever reason, but there's actually certain romances, like I believe Ashley's and Kaiden's female romance with a female, where it's actually entirely possible that whether due to a shepherd being asexual, or also it can be role played as being stress related, before the final confrontation of the games, you could basically turn away your love interest and say, I don't want to do anything before this, and yet you may still end up being able to continue the relationship more or less if you had done it. So, it can create a little bit of inconsistency because it's, for all intents and purposes, it may still feel like a physical relationship in the banter and whatnot, but it's actually kind of surprising that it's possible, maybe, in some instances, you'd have to do quite a bit of testing to figure out which ones, but with Thane, I believe, for obvious reasons, I think it's possible to just really not to have a physical aspect of the relationship in general, maybe other than some light kissing or something like that. I was personally very surprised to learn.
I think that's interesting that you mentioned, because I think that's another really important thing about asexual people, that there's this stereotype that asexual people don't want to have partnership or relationships, and actually asexual people can identify as heteroromantic, biromantic, and still want partnership, but just without the sexual aspect of it. I think that's really interesting that you mentioned that, that was part of the Kaiden romance, that could be part of the Kaiden romance for a female shepherd, that there was still the romance, but you can just tell him that you just want to spend the night together without having sex, And so, I think that's really important, and that's something that most people, because most people have sexuality, they don't think about, having that option.
Yeah, I mean, whether or not it's possible to never have any kind of sexual relation with certain characters requires some testing, but I think in general, from what I've seen, it is possible, at least with the Mass Effect 1 romances. That's a possibility. Maybe not Liara, depending on DLC. And the Citadel DLC might muddy that up a little bit, too, depending. But it's just, I guess it's something to look at for anyone who is sexual. They can actually see, in a game that, they might otherwise think is all about sex, they might actually see if they can manage that. Because, I think that's a good manner of representation, too. Obviously not one that's catered too much, just by the pure nature of the romances in games, but still very interesting. And the last example I guess I have, because admittedly there still are not many examples of this, although there may still be, obviously, there's all kinds of games out there. But the last example I have is from a game that honestly none of you all probably even know, probably most of the people watching this don't know, and that I might refer to again. There's a game, an indie game called Lauren the Amazon Princess, which is a visual novel and is it sort of has the visual representations and such of a dating sim, but it's surprisingly deep. And it has all kinds of romance options like this if you're into that. And Winterwolves, the company who does it, does a whole lot of games with romance. And supposedly, just for the record, is going to start doing possibly homosexual interest-only games that once they've gotten more acclimated to including them in their games that they have coming out now. But one of my, I think probably my favorite romance option in Lauren the Amazon Princess foil world is a character named Draco, who is absolutely adorable. And surprisingly enough, despite being more or less a chat's relationship, because he, I think, is one of the few characters who the sexuality aspect doesn't really come into it for the most part. Whether or not that actually makes him asexual, I don't know. But I think his romance is just sort of intended to be very sweet and not have the physical intimacy come into it as much. But surprisingly enough, he's actually also the gay romance of the cast. There's a very interesting inversion right there, and one that I'm particularly fond of. And he's a great character in general. So just if that piques your curiosity and whatnot. So it is very important for this kind of diversity to be addressed as well, because it does almost seem counterintuitive in a way to some people to have romances that will not eventually involve the physical aspects, because of course for some people in real life they don't think that even real life romance can involve just anything that doesn't have to do with sex some of the time. So yeah.
And with that, did you want to continue on to the next topic, Jonathan?
I guess this is probably
the opposite of the celibate relationship, I guess.
Celibacy, exactly. I think I phrased it as moresomes because
the moresomes, yes.
Goodness knows games can get up there as far as how many people you're able to have some of the time. But usually, what I'm referring to is threesomes or so on, which even that is more common than you might expect, or at least the suggestion of it. Jade Empire, I think we may have brought this up earlier. I think it is possible, actually, because two of the characters are bisexual, it's entirely possible to end up with both of them. However that plays out, I actually have no idea myself.
Yeah, I think that is possible, too.
Yeah, I don't know how exactly that plays out, but I mean, that's actually really surprising. In the same game where they censored the same-sex kissing, they allow you to be with both of them at the same time. I guess that's just how they decided to go with it. And then, famously, in Dragon Age Origins, there is the Isabella encounter, the first time you encounter Isabella in the entire series, and sure enough, yes, it is probably the most sexual encounter in either of the games, because you have a really amazing number of combinations you can do. You can be with Zebran or Liliana, or Zebran or Liliana, and you can even surprisingly, under a certain condition, be with Alistair.
Yeah, I'm not sharing Alistair. Not
sharing. No, of course not. Surprisingly, that's also not the only one. There's also one during the Dwarf Noble origin. I think the name was Kelly.
Yeah.
But suffice it to say, that one might not be such a good idea, depending on how you look at it. I mean, it's only for males, incidentally. But that should maybe give you a hint as to why maybe not. And then, of course, this is also sort of referenced in Mass Effect 1, where, as you might expect, it's possible to pursue both the heterosexual party member and Liara at the same time, and when they end up making you try to choose, you can actually suggest, well, why don't I have you both? And, well, suffice it to say that the human member doesn't think that's very reasonable.
I think it's really ironic that, if you're choosing between Liara or Kaiden's like, I didn't know you were interested in other women. I'm like, Kaiden, you're still a hypocrite.
Exactly. He was still a closet case.
Yeah.
And that's how some people have interpreted that. But interpretations fly all across the board.
Yeah, I mean, the people that appear most aggressively heterosexual are usually the most closeted.
Yes.
So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I think that's very true.
And then finally, another one that actually I haven't even personally played and that no one's probably heard of, but some company made a game called Summer Session, which is, I think, notable, A, for being romantic, and also B, it's notable in that, funnily enough, I think the only way to get a certain girl is if you share her with your equally male roommate, amazingly enough. Which is, I mean, who'd have thought? I mean, literally, I think the only way you can get that girl is if you and your male roommate, while you are a male yourself, agree to share her.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's something. I mean, not something you would necessarily expect.
Do you?
What?
No, go ahead, Jonathan.
Oh no, what were you gonna say?
So I guess this brings me into a big question that I'm curious what your thoughts are. Since we're talking about moresomes and things of that nature, do you think that some of the really controversial, some of the really controversial aspects of sexual diversity, such as polyamory, such as incest, such as, dare I say, bestiality, do you think things like that have a place in video games for the sake of diversity? Do you think there's a place for that?
Yeah, that's a question. I mean, for the latter two, frankly, it really has nothing to do with how I think of it anyway. I mean, society is going to decide that on its own one way or another. I would, you sort of imagine that it wouldn't. Who knows? But as for polyamory, I mean, I guess I'm a little bit open-minded about that. And, I mean, sure enough, this is already showing up in video games in some capacity. I don't think, and, well, okay, quite honestly, so is incest, so, go figure. But I think polyamory is going to continue to show up in some capacity. It may never quite become mainstream depending on how society goes one way or another. It's hard to say, as with all things at the time. But I mean, if we already have examples like this, even if they are mostly just random liaisons that happen to involve multiple people, I would imagine that there's probably still going to be a place somewhere for relationships like the Jade Empire one supposedly is, that can involve more than one romance option at the same time. Yeah, so I would imagine that much is probably going to happen eventually at some point or whatnot. Not just kind of being impartial on its sort of objective. It probably will.
How about you,
that's what the others I couldn't really even begin to tell you.
How about you, Kathleen? Do you think they have a place, or?
I think this comes down to like morals and what you feel about all of those things. Personally, I am pretty accepting of polyamorous relationships. As long as they're consenting between adults, and I typically don't have any problem with things that are consenting in between adults. The other two, I think the line of consent is a little bit blurry, like with bestiality. I think that my moral belief is that animals don't have the ability to
consent.
Negotiate that consent. And it's abuse, in my opinion. And when it comes to incest, the thing is that line of consent is also blurry because there comes a power struggle. I mean, especially if it's like, parents or siblings. There's usually a sibling that's older. And that really does kind of, even if it's between adults, I think that the line of consent can be blurry with that. And I think there's certain taboos that I think shouldn't be in place, but I stand by the incest taboo. I think that there's a reason that taboo exists. Not that I'm saying that there aren't probably exceptions out there of loving couples and, whatever, but I think that for the most part, I'm totally against that, and I don't want to see that in games. But it comes down to, like, what you morally believe,
Right.
The reason balance. I mean, you could sort of say the same thing about power imbalance between a student and their teacher. Whether or not consent is really given in that circumstance, and yet, of course, that's still pretty prevalent in a lot of games. I mean, not the least of which Spoiler Bird is coming up on top. So, I mean, it's going to depend one way or another.
Yeah,
well, I would agree with a lot of what Kathleen said.
The reason why I say that is because I'm just to play devil's advocate, the three of us, we are perfectly cool with the aspect of homosexuality in video games, and yes, homosexuality has a place in video games because to us, it's not morally wrong to have homosexuality, but there definitely are people who feel very strongly against homosexuality because they think it's morally wrong, just like we think that bestiality, incest, and to a certain degree, I mean, some of us are more accepting of polyamory or others from a moral standpoint. So, the argument could be said, well, if it's consensual again with polyamory, they're not hurting anyone, just like the argument where we say, let us get married, let same genders get married because we're not hurting you. People can say the same thing about incest. People can say the same thing about polyamory. And so, in our generation, like, it's starting to become more accepted of homosexuality becoming more prevalent in media like video games. So, and again, just to play devil's advocate, a lot of people who are against homosexuality or against portraying homosexuality and things are in video games, a lot of them make the argument, well, if you're going to let homosexuality into video games, what's going to come next? Polyamory, incest? Like, if all of a sudden we're going to have bestiality in video games too. Like, they see this as sort of a downward spiral. So that's the only reason why I'm bringing that up, is because whether or not you think that's true or not, if you think that there is this spiral because the next generation might be more open to polyamory and the next generation of that might be more open to incest. And,
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's hard to say. I absolutely understand where you were going with that, and it's so true. People just think, people think of so many different things as downward spirals, and in some cases, you got to give them credit, I guess. Maybe that is how it worked out. But that's not to say all downward spirals are bad. But yeah, it's a valid point.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely didn't think we'd be talking about that, but fair enough. Going off the list.
I'm just trying to be very representative of as many people as possible, even if it's something that I don't agree with. Even if something I don't agree with. Just wanted to bring it up.
Yeah.
The next topic is, I think, a little more fun, and it's about matchmaking, right? Right. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah. People tend to, frankly, people like to do this in real life, where you try to get people together for the sake of love, for the sake of one thing or another. And so games have obviously reflected that too. And in a lot of games that allow you to have your own romance partner, you get a chance a lot of the time to maybe even have a romance partner that you could normally go after end up with someone else, or maybe whether or not you intend for them to. In Mass Effect, some of the most famous examples are, spoiler alert, Joker and Edie, where you can actually sit there and support it or say that it shouldn't happen, and that'll bring them together or won't. And so, that's a certain degree of choice. And I think in the Citadel DLC, you have Ashley and James Vega, who can also potentially hook up if you are not involved with either of them. And also, some lighter examples like, arguably lighter, I guess, in this particular case, the Krogan Char and Ereba.
I love those two.
Sorry, and in Mass Effect.
I love those two, yes.
Tally and Garrus.
Tally and Garrus. Oh, that's huge.
Yeah, I wasn't really sure whether...
totally shipping them before that.
Yes. Yeah, I wasn't sure whether or not you could actually say not for them not to get together. I don't know. But I guess one way or another.
I feel like my mental waves, they affected it somehow.
Yeah.
Because we were all shipping them before that.
Yeah.
I was.
And of course, I guess the one problem with that some of the time is, much less with Tali and Garrus, because some people saw their chemistry for the most part. That's pretty well accepted. But I know that in Dragon Age 2, Fenris and Isabella are supposed to get together in some capacity if you don't romance either of them. But that situation is odd to some people, I guess, because of how Fenris's romance plays out with each, to the point where you wouldn't really think. It's very heavily implied they're just friends with benefits. Yeah. And to some people to be out of character for Fenris.
Yeah.
Some people think that's out of character. It can depend on how you look at it, I guess.
Don't forget Aveline and Donic in Dragon Age 2.
And
I mean, there was a
Aveline and
whole
Donic,
quest. There was a whole side quest for that. Aveline and Donic.
Yeah, and it's very sweet if you do go that route and everything. So, yeah, these tend to be some of the more fun quests because, you know, it's in a way it's loving vicariously, especially if it's people you can't get normally.
You can't normally romance, yes.
And I mean, also in Dragon Age Origins have Cameron and Gaina, which is particularly notable because you can absolutely screw it up as well. I mean, not even just you can just slash a knife through whatever the heck they have.
Yes.
And also, I guess, spoiler alert from the game that I referred to earlier, War and the Amazon Princess, was a very sweet possibility of getting the two dwarven characters to fall for each other. You can't romance either of them themselves. So, I mean, I guess like goes for like, or their kind goes for their kind, or something like that. But it's pretty nice like that.
I definitely hope that that BioWare or other video game companies give us the option to be able to do a little bit of matchmaking too, because it is a lot of some of us really appreciate it, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it makes other characters seem more alive and less like they're romanced by you.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. That's always nice.
I can definitely see the argument that, you know, doing that requires a few more extra resources that could be better put somewhere else.
That's for everything, honestly.
Yeah, I mean,
everything
you can say
about that.
You can definitely say that about anything, and you know, just the mere fact that if with Tali and Garrus, for example, you have to add extra logic in there, such that if you happen to already be romancing one of the two, then it might be a little awkward if you catch them, you know, making out, and you're like dating one of them, so they might want to put some extra logic. I mean, they don't have to, but they might want to put some extra logic to prevent that from happening. So,
or it's like, nah, you know.
It's
fine. I allow it.
Yeah, I know that, it's sort of in that vein. I know that, I guess sort of in that vein. I know that there was a bug with Zevran in Dragon Age 2 where even if you had romanced him in Dragon Age Origins, he would apparently be up for anything with Hawk and or Isabella.
Oh, I see.
And some people did not take kindly to that. Obviously.
Yeah, I would not have either.
No, I wouldn't be. It was just a bug, though, so obviously it wasn't.
Yeah.
So that happens every once in a while, too. But, you know, I mean, game logic is complicated in that regard. Wow. We've gone through an awful lot, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, we have a few more left, but I don't know if those are things we necessarily think we need to touch on. I think we've been very
just touch on them at least quickly, because you know, you tend to think. I mean, basically, what we've been talking about so far, for the most part, has been romantic diversity in video games as an art form. You know, video games where you have a TV and it shows you the graphical image and you hear the music and everything like that. Whereas I mentioned this before, but I've grown very fond of games that are text-based and usually don't have much of the bells and whistles that we take for granted in AAA titles and whatnot. You know, obviously these are indie-related, and harken back to some of the earliest examples of gaming, actually. But there's a whole lot of games with romantic possibilities that are completely text-based. And one of the advantages to those is that with less resources devoted to visual stuff, they tend to actually be able to have more options. I mean, there are one of my favorite examples or formats for this, I guess you could say, is a company called ChoiceScript, or Choice of Games, who has developed an engine called ChoiceScript that makes it surprisingly easy to create text-based games. And almost all of the games that you can find on that website and in the forums have some degree of romantic option to take and whatnot. And some of them are really good. They offer great examples of romantic diversity in text form, more or less. So, you know, it requires a lot of reading and isn't as flashy and whatnot, but it's still very legitimate, and it tends to have very great stories because they don't have to devote much time to anything else in general.
True. That's very true.
Yeah, it's very. Yeah. And then finally, I guess to more or less round out the topic of romantic diversity, which obviously has been very, very broad. This is just more superficial. The things that you automatically see when you look at a romance option, such as hair color, for instance. And BioWare, I don't know, BioWare seems to have an interesting example of what they do with hair color in their games. Because one of the things that I realized about Mass Effect recently is that there's not a single blonde romance option, for one.
Yeah.
And most of the romance options of humans, of course, obviously.
That actually has something to do with the lore. Because mainly it's because blonde hair in the Mass Effect universe is really rare because it takes place hundred years in the future or whatever. Wait, no.
And races are implied to have.
Wait, what time does it take place in again? Sorry, I'm getting tired.
No. I think you're roughly right. You're roughly correct.
The idea is that as we years and years ahead of now, there will be less people with blonde hair, less people with blue eyes. There'll be more people with tanner skin because there'll be a lot more
dominant
interracial
genes.
relationships,
right.
And dominant genes, yeah. And so with that scientific theory, the blonde hair in the Mass Effect universe is really rare.
That's what I think.
And so is people with pale skin is really rare. So that's why they colored Miranda's hair black, or darker, because it didn't really match the lore. So yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, and that makes absolute sense, and that's one of the things I really like about that decision is that it supported their lore almost perfectly. I mean, you still had a few blonde characters here and there, I believe, and you also, as far as race and ethnicity was concerned, I mean, despite the supposed implication that most of the races had more or less interbred so much that differentiation wasn't as prominent, you still had Jacobs and you still had Kasumis and whatnot. So I mean, they still made some characters that were, very appropriately what they were supposed to be and whatnot. But I just think it was really kind of cool that not only did you not tend to have like your blonde romance characters, which most games do. I mean, they try to go for the sort of the Charlie's Angels like assortment of hair colors and whatnot when it comes to the women at the very least. Is that they actually leaned much more towards the darker sides of the spectrum when it came to the color of the skin, the color of the hair, and whatnot, which was really cool. I think.
I agree.
I mean, certainly for people who prefer blonde, maybe not so much, but it's at least more supported. So you can always argue that. And what's interesting about Dragon Age, in complete antithesis to that, actually, is Dragon Age has sort of been on and off about its diversity of whether or not they're going for like a more or less Charlie's Angels kind of thing. Because in the original Dragon Age Origins, you had Morgan and Leliana, who both had different hair color. Morgan was dark, Leliana was red, whereas both Alistair and Zevran were blonde, more or less. Alistair was sort of dirtier and whatnot, but still. And that's actually one of the good things about the Sir Gilmore mod is that, especially for those who prefer red hair, it gave them...
Yeah, like me. Everyone knows I'm a sucker for the red hair.
And of course, that's the same thing with Sebastian, and for those who had applied in Dragon Age 2. And Dragon Age 2, along with a few other aspects of the characters, Dragon Age 2 was an interesting balance for the reason that both of the female characters had dark hair and both of the male characters had light, except for Sebastian. And Hollis, I think, technically had red hair and could be considered one too. Of course, Dragon Age 2 in some cases was a very interesting game when it came to the balancing of the romantic options. And I guess this is a part where I sort of tried to bring all of this together because, of course, there are absolutely probably some people sitting here saying, why the heck does any of this matter? Because, I mean, when you look at these things individually, the racial diversity, sexual, what their gender is, hair color, none of them really matter much in general if you just look at them individually. But when you put them together into characters and then you start to organize those characters based on what gender they're going to be, what sexuality they're going to be, I mean, I think one of the reasons that Dragon Age Origins in particular was such a popular romantic game, other than the fact that it was the first in the series and whatnot. But it's such a good game for romance, and actually I think they did their balancing of their romance options pretty well, other than the sexuality thing, which obviously that was just what it was. But I mean, you had 2 options for men, 2 options for women. You had the women had different hair colors, the men not so much, but that's offset by the Sturgill more mod and whatnot. You
and
had
mods, all the mods that you can change people's appearance to
and
whatever
all the
you
mods
want.
that you can use to their color too. You know,
Yeah.
mods are obviously a great thing for those who just don't want to play by the rules
Right.
of whatnot. Yeah. And you had, and personality-wise, I mean, both of the romance options were very different from each other. And it really showed. It was striking how different they were, to the point where people naturally would gravitate more towards Alistair, and there are some people who gravitated more towards Severin, and the same thing with Leliana and Morrigan. I mean, I see confessions on Tumblr all the time where people sit there and say that even Severin and Morrigan, they can never romance anyone else because they just appeal to them that much. So, I mean, I think they did really well, other than the sexuality thing, in Dragon Age Origins with varying, making sure that the 2 options for either gender or sexuality were not too similar. And that's something that, in general, I think is what really makes romantic diversity in art form. And I think, again, BioWare would agree, is that you sort of have to look at all these different aspects of the characters and think, well, are we going to make our gay option the only one with dark hair? Because maybe we better make them bi so that women who want to romance someone with dark hair maybe will have an option or something like that. And, you know, that's obviously very superficial stuff, but then you get more into stuff like skin tone and personality especially. And I think that's one of the interesting things, is that they're doing that, quite a bit of consideration with that with Dragon Age Inquisition. I'm actually surprised we've gone this long without mentioning Inquisition, surprisingly enough. Not that we know what all the romance options are just yet, but you can already get a sense through romantic diversity and how they might have thought about it, of who might be the romance options for what gender, for what sexuality, etc. And actually that's part of the reason why I'm starting to anticipate who may be of what sexuality and whatnot, because the balance otherwise would seem like it would be off, which is entirely possible they'll keep it off, because, you know, sometimes you just have to think about the character and not, well, do we have enough redheads on this side? Actually, and going back to Dragon Age 2, I sort of touched on this a little bit before, but I think Dragon Age 2 was still romantically, I think, pretty successful. I mean, it was a Dragon Age game. It had romance options. People eat it up regardless. But I think one of the reasons, and you, I think, touched on this maybe a little bit in one of your videos for Dragon Age 2 Art, one of the reasons that they might not have been quite as successful, especially in the cases of the male romance options, is, especially in personality, you sort of got the feeling that Anders and Fenris, while still different, kind of came from the same sides of a coin some of the time. Would you say that's correct? That
I think so.
They had very similar feelings towards whatever, had very strong feelings of hatred towards mages or Templars, respectively, and that a lot of their personality was informed by that, to the point where they both ended up seeming very bitter. They both had kind of more darker personalities, especially, let's be honest, Anders, who's completely different than he was in Awakening. And in addition to that, both Anders and Fenris had like white hair and stuff like that. And while both Isabel and Meryl had dark, and Sebastian was and Talos were the odd children. And so the way it kind of turned out to be was that both of the male options had very dark personalities with occasional moments of lightness, whereas both female characters had very light personalities with occasional moments of darkness. And I think that led to some people thinking, well, but they're kind of similar. I mean, less so for the females. I think they did maybe a little bit better job with the females, but I think that's part of the reason why you almost sort of get to the point where you're like, I don't know, do I really like either of them more than the other?
Exactly. That was my problem. And
I think that's fair. I mean, I had pretty much the opinion of the male robots in Dragon Age 2 as you did for the most part. And obviously that wasn't helped by Sebastian being
right. But Sebastian was definitely the one that I was most interested, even though he was the celibate option. Sebastian was the one I was mostly interested, because it was fine that he was a celibate option, because disliked the romances of both Fenris and Anders so much that I ended up having to choose the one that I hated the least.
Yeah.
So, or it's so.
And I just think that part of the reason is because in a lot of ways they may have made the two options for either gender maybe just too similar, and so it just sort of made the balance feel a little bit off. And I do think that has an effect. I mean, I think that's, again, I think that's part of the reason why the Origins romances were so much better.
Yeah.
And, just going back to all of it, I do think there's kind of an art form for this, and it's very interesting seeing with each new romance option unveiled with Dragon Age Inquisition, how this may affect what they consider the balance to be. And actually, okay, so spoiler alert, I'm not sure if even either of you all have necessarily heard this. Spoiler alert for Dragon Age Inquisition, but it was recently unveiled for the first character whose sexuality it was. It was recently unveiled that Sarah, the elven archer, is the female option for female characters and is exclusively female. BioWare has decided to go with the straight bisexual gay model, which is interesting, and we'll see how that goes. But Sarah is exclusively a female option. And what's interesting about that is that if you look at the other females of the group, and any one of them could become romanceable, probably not Liliana, I would think.
I would not think so.
Yeah, I would not think so. But you have the other three females that were shown to be in the group. You have Vivienne, you have Cassandra, and you have the mysterious scribe, whoever. And none of them are elves. So surprisingly enough, that would actually mean that for one of the few times in gaming history, and Dragon Age Origins did this too technically, but I mean, you tend to find that elven female characters tend to be for men more often than not. I mean, I think a lot of jokes were made at Baldur's Gate too for having every single one of the female romance options be elves, and even the enhanced edition put in a half elf. So, I mean, it's kind of surprising that they would go the other end of the direction, especially since it meant that men would not have any elven options for as far as female characters went. Of course, does this matter to everyone? No. But I think it's very interesting that they would choose to go that way. Because, I don't know, it almost would seem to make sense to make her bisexual so that any guy who wanted an elf could still have her.
Right.
One of the things that I am most fascinated by is how game developers take the facets of sexuality, gender, race, personality, superficial ones like hair color and so on, and they put them all together into these characters, and then they try to find a balancing act that will make the most people happy if at all possible. I mean, I think it's one of the great things about More in the Amazon Princess, I'm bringing it up again, is that they actually seem to have a very queer conscience when it comes to that, and it ended up, as far as I can tell, working out pretty well.
Right.
With a few and so I'm very interested to see how Dragon Age Inquisition is possibly going to do that.
Understandably, the more diversity that you could put in any game of any aspect, not only romance, the more you'll be able to cater to more people. So yes. I think that's the big thing that we can take out of the conversation.
As with everything, it can be a balancing act, and it's always interesting to see how they do it one way or another.
Right. Great. Okay, well, Shen, thank you again so much for bringing this topic up in the first place, and definitely has been a great conversation. I mean, it's a pretty lengthy conversation, and believe me, we can still continue on talking about this because we've only just hit the tip of the iceberg of this thing. And Kathleen, thank you again so much for taking the time to join us as well.
It was a great conversation, and we covered some really interesting topics, so totally.
Great. All right, folks. So again, thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Hopefully you found something interesting and maybe even learned a thing or two during the process. So I still have one more. I have one more person that I need to do a podcast with, who is the third winner of my Let's Talk contest, which was Lucky Jack 20. We will be talking about video games based on movies and movies based on video games. So that should be a pretty interesting and fun topic to talk about as well. So until next time, everybody, love yourselves and love each other.